Really hope you enjoyed the Thanksgiving weekend. We've got some players in the Ontario Hockey League giving thanks for some entry level contracts. We've got firsts or firsts again and lasts to cover this week, and so much more. My name's Mike Farwell on Twitter at Farwell_OHL. That guy over there, Dan Mahar, on Twitter at Dan Mahar, just like the name says. And it's been a bit of a weird week, Dan. 2 weeks into this Ontario Hockey League regular season, and some real meat on the bone as we dive into this week's episode. So let's go to Flint first. And I don't know how surprised you were, but I'll put myself in the category as very surprised to learn that Ted Dent was no longer the head coach of the Firebirds.
Yeah, I am too, Mike. This is really early for a coach dismissal, and certainly did not think Ted Dent was on the hot seat. But I mean, Flint has had some off ice issues over time, and you never know what's happening. To me, to have something happen this quickly, you have to wonder what was happening behind the scenes. And I think on the ice, clearly what it came down to is not only were the Firebirds losing, but they weren't even competitive. And I think to have that home opener just be an embarrassing blowout to what should be a lower tier team in front of your home fans, that's a really bad sign, a red flag, if you will. But I'm still shocked at how quickly this went down.
So you said an interesting word there, and this is one of the really interesting parts of this story for me. You said dismissal, which is the first thing I thought, and I think we all thought 2 games in. Yes, awful games. I think we touched on it last week. You lose 11-3 on the road. You come home and lose 8-0. So not a great opening weekend for the Flint Firebirds. 19-3 they're outscored, and absolutely an embarrassment on home ice in their opener there. But nobody has used the word dismissal or firing or anything like that. At the same time, nobody also has used the word resignation. So, and if you read the release from the team, you get the and anybody that's worked in any corporate organization in their lives understands the best of luck in their future endeavors email or memo that goes out. I've read it more times than I care to in my life. And that's the language that was used. We wish Ted best of luck in his future endeavors. So that does sound like what you said, but nobody used the word dismissal. Nobody used the word resignation. And that to me just leaves so many questions. Again, as bad as the start was, it's 2 games in. You just went through. No, Ted Dent last season became the winningest coach in Firebirds franchise history. I know it's not a long history for that franchise, but still the winningest coach. Ted Dent, arguably, was the reason that the Flint Firebirds just set a record number of players being drafted into the National Hockey League this past summer. Tristan Bartucci, Nathan Day, Colson Petrie, and Ethan Hay. I mean, how does that in any way signal that the guy's not getting the job done? And again, 2 games. Frankly, if this is on your mind, do it in the summer. I don't know. Anyway, it's just it leaves me asking a lot of questions, but specific to nobody said dismissed, nobody said relieved of duties, nobody said resigned, although you do get that language that so many of us love to hate. Best of luck in your future endeavors. Yikes, Flint. Yikes.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make, Mike, about the language there, and I read into it as probably out of respect for Ted Dent, what he has done for Flint and rescued them from some hard times. They didn't necessarily want to make it sound like he was being turfed after 2 games. But it's also why I reference the things going on behind the scenes. Because you're right, Mike, nothing about this makes logical sense. If you commit to a coach for a season, you're going to give him more than 2 games. A lot can happen. We know Colson Petrie and Hayes were not yet back from their tryouts, so there was some players missing. Any coach gets more rope than that. But on the other side, you say, well, maybe this was Dent deciding to walk away. Well, why would he commit all of training camp and all of the exhibition season only to call it quits after 2 games that didn't go well? So I'm sure there's much more to this story. Discussions happening behind the scenes. Maybe his heart wasn't in it. Maybe his head wasn't in it. Maybe who knows? But interesting wording is definitely I did notice as well.
Yeah, and considering where the Flint Firebirds are at in their cycle, likely taking a bit of a step back this season. I don't know. And I can also tell you from having been in Flint on the opening weekend and talking to Ted Dent, he seemed to be in a good place. Not that he would have any reason to indicate to me that there's trouble behind the scenes or he was thinking of leaving, but there was certainly no indication, and I didn't read anything into the words that were spoken between us that would have suggested that a move like this was imminent. Nonetheless, Paul Fleisch, I'm sorry, Paul, I'll get your name right as we move forward. Former Brampton Battalion moves over to take over as the head coach now with the Flint Firebirds. Okay, from Flint, let's shift over to the Eastern Conference and the other big story, but you might have missed it. I only caught this, and it was kind of interesting to me too. I only caught this online because the Barrie Colts released a statement in response to an article written by Barrie Ward, and I should probably be careful about calling it an article. Barrie Ward is a longtime Barrie area journalist, decades of experience. He writes an opinion piece now called Fair Comment. So articles slash reporting versus columns slash editorial are different things. Nonetheless, Barrie Ward writes an editorial, an opinion piece, and the Barrie Colts decide this requires a response. And team owner Howie Campbell signs the response, which was rather lengthy. I think if you were counting words, the response might have been twice as long, double the number of words as the initial fair comment piece written by Barrie Ward. But the gist of it is that there are some financial discrepancies or irregularities between the Barrie Colts and the city of Barrie, which is supposed to share in revenues from both advertising and concessions at the Sadlin Arena. And there are discrepancies as reported by Barrie Ward, and then the response from the Barrie Colts. Dan, what do you make of all of this?
Well, I mean, first point to touch on is kind of something you noticed about the length of the response from the Barrie Colts. And I mean, the first thought that crossed my mind might be thou doth protest too much. It seemed like a disproportionate response to what Barrie Ward had written. I actually admit I read the rebuttal first and then went back and looked into the article that Barrie Ward had written. And I was actually surprised at kind of how non-controversial the initial piece was. Now, there were certainly some suggestions in there that obviously Howie Campbell and the team took an exception to about maybe not reporting some revenues, potentially cheating the city was kind of maybe the inference there. So I get why there was a stronger response, but it was certainly a fulsome response. I believe I saw the words disappointed in there. There were a few terms that the Barrie Colts and Howie Campbell used to reply to this that suggested they were very, very disappointed with the reporting and felt that Mr. Ward should have maybe checked with them first to get some of these things cleared up. And there was also some reference in there to just how things went during the pandemic. And I think all these teams had kind of different methodologies for how they dealt with the pandemic and different accounting. And I think some of that got washed up in the uncertainty and mystery around the pandemic, which was kind of suggested in the rebuttal. But yeah, it's a puzzling case, Mike, and I thought that was quite a bombastic reply.
So I was exactly like you on this. I saw first the Barrie Colts response to the recent media article or whatever it was called. And I read the response. And then, quite frankly, I couldn't wait to read the initial report because I thought if I'm getting a response like this, I'm rubbing my hands together thinking this is going to be awesome. And I'm not trying to disrespect Barrie Ward here, but I'm with you. The original column or the response was very much, in my opinion, disproportionate to the original column itself. So then my antennae go up a little bit. So if I can, because I've also, like Barrie Ward, spent several decades working in media. If you don't mind, can I just put on my hat here as a media guy? And I'll start with Barrie Ward and his fair comment piece. Sure, I think in a perfect world, and maybe Barrie would even admit this, you do seek at least comment from the Barrie Colts organization when you're reporting on something the likes of which Barrie reported, these financial irregularities, these discrepancies. But here's the thing. It's not like Barrie Ward is just quoting or reporting information from some random Joe or Jane on the street. Again, please bear with me. I'm a media guy, and I'm a bit of a political junkie as well, especially municipal politics. And what Barrie Ward is reporting on is a report that's coming before Barrie City Council. Like, this is stuff that's prepared by staff at the city of Barrie. So it's my long way of saying it's an authoritative source here. Yes, you could seek comment from Howie Campbell and the Barrie Colts for sure, but the bottom line is, as the city of Barrie and the Barrie Colts renegotiate their financial arrangements, which was the point of Barrie Ward's article. I have to keep saying Barrie Ward because I don't want to get mixed up with City of Barrie, but the point of Barrie Ward's column was just that. With these discrepancies currently being negotiated or being figured out, it's going to be really interesting as they renegotiate the overall agreement between team and city. Fair comment, just like the title of the column suggests. So it's he's coming, Barrie Ward is from a very authoritative source. These are reports prepared by intelligent, well-paid staff people at the city of Barrie. And look, it's easy for me to say when it's not my money. And we know that there's not huge money in every market in the Ontario Hockey League for sure. But if you add up the numbers that Barrie Ward cites in his column, we're talking in and around $120,000. Now, it's made clear a couple of times in that column. These numbers are likely on the low side because of the information that hasn't been shared or obtained because of these discrepancies, et cetera. But we're talking 120K. And again, recognizing the revenue we're talking about in the OHL, sure, that's a lot. It's a lot more money than I have, but it's not like we're talking in the millions here. So you start adding all this up, and again, I'm going to go to what sounded very much to me like a disproportionate response on the part of the Barrie Colts organization. And I'm going to take you way back in the day to when really the only source of information or media was the print media. And the old joke from back then, you've probably heard this before, don't get into a pissing contest with a reporter because the reporter buys ink by the barrel, right? So you might get a soundbite when radio was first coming out, or you might get a quote in the newspaper, but a columnist gets all this space and they will just keep going and going and going, and they have more ink than you have airtime for, right? So that's, don't get into the pissing contest. Obviously today there's no ink being purchased by the barrel, and all of this shows up at barrietoday.com, an online publication. So Howie Campbell and the Barrie Colts figure, we're not buying ink by the barrel anymore. All we need is bandwidth and we can respond. But I think the point of not getting into a pissing contest still stands. Again, maybe I'm biased because I'm in the media. I just don't think you're helping your cause in any way by engaging in what is now a very public pissing contest. It's $120,000. Friggin' figure it out, guys. But this, to me, if I were just offering my guidance from a PR perspective, my advice would have been take a breath, take a step back, let Barrie Ward write whatever he wants to write. It's not worth it. Clearly, the Barrie Colts feel differently. And now I'm down off my soapbox.
Well, yeah, but you basically we're on the same page here, Mike. Whenever you have an emotional response to anything, the best business is just give it some time, wait till the emotions die down, then reply rationally. And I think you hit on the piece about journalism and how it's conducted. And I think, yes, on the surface, it's always good. A story comes your way, check all your sources, talk to various sides, and then try and compile it. There's a slight nuance here, or a slight difference when you're reporting on city matters and council matters. And I think when you find a lot of reporters doing that, will be first on the news coming out of council, emanating from council, and often they'll just bring forth something that caught their attention at council. So it's not necessarily a situation saying, well, this involved other parties, I should talk to them too. No, it's I'm reporting on the information that was presented at council. And in a lot of ways, it's maybe Barrie Ward calling out the city staff or the reporting more than the Barrie Colts, saying, something didn't quite add up here. This is the information being presented publicly by our local municipal government. What am I missing? What's not adding up? And being first to spotlight this for the public and say, I noticed this, something's up here. We'll follow up further. But yeah, obviously Howie Campbell and the Barrie Colts said that and felt they were being called out for some hinky or mismanagement or whatever you want to call it, and just emotionally pounced. So you're right. There was probably a news cycle there where it was going to pass pretty quickly with the fairly low dollar amounts. But I think that's the dynamic we had at play here, is that Barrie Ward's pulling some of this out of the reporting municipally, and the team just really took it as a shot and said, no, we got to get on top of this quickly.
That's some missing context from what I said, because certainly in the context of a city's budget, Barrie, London, Ottawa, Owen Sound, $120,000 is like the proverbial drop in the bucket. May mean more certainly to the Barrie Colts, but great point there. And I'll also to say, again, just being clear about my bias, I have been that reporter on more occasions than I can count, going over a council agenda. Yes, I read these reports to find information that I think might be interesting. And frankly, if there was such an agreement, well, there kind of is. If I just bring it home to the city of Kitchener, forgive me, but the Kitchener Rangers had an interest-free loan from the city of Kitchener to complete its renovation, and this goes back a decade now, and this and that, and there's a repayment schedule. If there were discrepancies in that and I came across it in a report, you can bet I would find that interesting enough, I think, to share. Everything's been just fine as far as the Kitchener Rangers and the city of Kitchener are concerned. It makes me wonder, Dan, if, and it frankly suggests to me, Howie Campbell doesn't care too much for Barrie Ward, and maybe vice versa. I know nothing about the political dynamic in Barrie. I know nothing about the sports slash political dynamic in Barrie, but this suggests to me that maybe one party doesn't like the other, or maybe they don't like each other. I haven't the foggiest, but when you see this story and the way it's developed, that's what it suggests to me.
Oh, completely. Let's not make any mistake about it. There are biases everywhere. And if anyone ever felt they were not treated fairly in the past by a particular journalist, then that's going to bring the emotions to the surface anytime those two come together again in any form. So, and let's face it, like, I'm not indicting journalists across the board. There's lots of terrific ones that do their job really well, but there are some that do have biases or picks on people and aren't always fair. So you can see how this happens. And I don't know the history between Barrie Ward and Howie Campbell or the Barrie Colts, but clearly it ruffled some feathers, the reporting he did on council.
Real quick, journalists, their histories, their record, their integrity, etc. So we're releasing this episode just after the Thanksgiving weekend, which in the region of Waterloo is also a big weekend with KW Oktoberfest, a huge festival. If you've never been here before for Oktoberfest, you should get here sometime for it because it's awesome. That includes the Thanksgiving Day Oktoberfest parade. I participated in that parade, and all of a sudden I'm hearing somebody yelling out, "Farwell, Farwell, boo, boo." And I'm like, what the heck? Turn around, friggin' Ryan Payette. Ryan Payette of the London Free Press booing me. And I'm just out there trying to do some good. And they're, love the guy, love the guy. But if you ever see the online back and forth between he and I now, guy booed me publicly in a parade. Son of a gun. I just want to touch on one more thing. That's all in good fun. He really did, but he was doing it in good fun. I'm not angry at him. I thought it was a funny aside based on what Dan said. I just want to touch on one more thing though, with this Barrie Colts, Barrie today, Barrie Ward. Oh my goodness, for the love of berries situation, because it reminded me of something that I thought odd, and now I think even odder based on this story. So last season, when we did a game in Barrie, I'm not, I don't want to get on Howie's bad side because next thing you know, there's going to be a response to this podcast, but I'm just going to tell it like it is. The media room offerings left a little to be desired. There were cupcakes, like literally somebody had brought in like 6 or 8, there might have been a dozen cupcakes. Like it's dinner time. All I ask for really is like if I could get a piece of pizza or a sandwich and a cup of coffee, but it was just maybe it was a bad night in Barrie. I'm not trying to rag on them, but that's just the truth. I had an opportunity to have a cupcake. I passed because I wanted some dinner. So I just decided, well, it's going to be one of those nights. So before I went on the air at the Sadlin Arena, I went to the concession to grab a bite to eat. And then I waited in line and I'm like, I gotta get on the air. It's getting pretty close to airtime, but I gotta get some food in me. I'd like, whatever. I get to the front of the line and I pull out my debit card and she says, "Oh, sorry, cash only." I'm like, "Excuse me, hang on. Like I just got offered a cupcake in the media room and now I need cash in my pocket to buy like whatever I just or are you seriously? Cash only." Well, there's an ATM wherever. And listen, if you don't know this about me, I am as cheap as the day is long. And there is no way in HE double hockey sticks, A, I'm withdrawing from an ATM that's not my own because I don't want to pay the service charge to my bank. And B, definitely not some random, like the ones you see in bars, because there's a service charge on the ATM plus the service charge from your bank. This is all just a little bit of background on me. Bottom line is, I got nothing to eat that night. Whatever, woe is me. But it struck me as odd that in 2023, you can't use your debit card to buy something at the concession stand in a hockey arena. And this came out in Barrie Ward's column. And, you know, it's weird. I'm sorry for Colts fans. Like clearly you get used to this, I guess, and you take cash with you to the game. But Dan, this is not just me, right? Cash only in a hockey arena in 2023. Like that's just downright weird.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think maybe the cupcakes were them trying to send you a subtle message, but
Have another
no,
cupcake.
I think I think in the column. So you're right, absolutely. In 2023, I know so many people that don't even know what cash is anymore. So
Sure.
they'd starve if they found cash. You mentioned it was referenced in the article, and I believe, yeah, Howie Campbell pointed out that only in certain segments of the concourse, because they're temporary stands, they didn't have the electronic setup, et cetera, for anything beyond cash. But at various other points in the arena, they had card
Yeah,
availability.
in
So
the private suites, you have to be a high roller or you have to be a member of the hockey elite. Anyway, I'm zipping.
yeah.
It's weird. It's weird.
I don't disagree. It is weird. Well, I would say it is self-defeating more as much as weird because you're turning away a lot of business.
Okay, let's move on from that and we'll just leave it for you to figure out how you feel about all of it. And if you haven't read, honestly, it's some pretty interesting soap opera-esque drama 2 weeks into the OHL season. It was a great weekend, certainly in the city of Brantford. After almost 40 years, the Ontario Hockey League is back in Brantford. I think Dan and I have made clear that we feel pretty strongly that OHL hockey is going to remain in Brantford. Not only have they renovated the existing Civic Center, but there's already talk about maybe building something new that would be perfectly OHL sized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's no disrespect to Hamilton. It's just the writing on the wall. But what a comeback as the Bulldogs get their first win of the season. And I mean, if this fan base wasn't jazzed before the opening game this past weekend, they are certainly, and I saw lots of pictures from fans that were at that game, and I think Brantford has them hooked. The Bulldogs have them hooked on OHL hockey again.
Yeah, well, you saw the emotion when Florian Jacki scored the first goal in that building at the OHL level in nearly 40 years, and he reacted like he had just scored an overtime goal in the playoffs for good reason. Followed it up by getting kicked out for a slew foot, but that aside, you could just see the emotion from him scoring that goal and from the rest of his team saying, we're back. They've clearly embraced the city. The city's clearly embraced them, and that's a great story for the OHL.
Paul Fixter was telling me we had some time on the road this past weekend, and we were just reminiscing about the Brantford Alexanders, of course, the last OHL team to play there. And Fixie said, "That's a great name, eh? Alexanders. Well, yeah, the Telephone City and Alexander Graham Bell, et cetera, et cetera." But I have fond memories. The franchise wasn't there too long, but it played its last game in April of 1984. And I don't know. I think it's the right size market. Community is different than it was back in the early 1980s, but I'm happy for the city. I'm happy for the fans of the Bulldogs that really got themselves a treat this past weekend.
Yeah, and I'm happy for the Bulldogs. I mean, when you have a full building, the players themselves feed off that. And I think that it's going to pay dividends as the season goes on. That's a younger team that we haggled over where to put them in the predictions. But I think a full building and an enthusiastic crowd actually might bump you a slot or two in the standings. So I think it's a good marriage.
If you think about the way the Bulldogs franchise has been operating of late, championships in 18 and then again in 22, and now you just mentioned this young Bulldogs team. Look, it's harder than it sounds on paper, but this fan base getting this team at this stage in its development may very well be planning something in 2026 or so, because I don't know, just Matt Turk as the GM who took over for Steve Stais certainly seems to be has the team on that same trajectory. Again, lots of things have to fall into place, but wouldn't that be nice for Brantford as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's like you said, it's a good story all around. And I know Steve Stais moved on to the Ottawa Senators, but I know his paw prints aren't too far away from this team and won't be for a while. And having some of the connections that team's going to have and the support they have, I think, yeah, you're right. They can start eyeing some big things in a year or two.
So we were just talking about how weird it is to not be able to use a debit card or a credit card at a concession stand in a hockey arena in 2023. How's this for a little bit of weirdness too? I mentioned that the last game that the Brantford Alexanders played, the last OHL Brantford game in the city of Brantford, goes back to April 8th, 1984. But that wasn't the last OHL game played in Brantford. That was the last Alexander's game. The last OHL game played in Brantford prior to this past weekend was on April the 25th of 1984. And that was a playoff game and a meaningful game 7 between the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds and the Kitchener Rangers. And the reason the game was played in Brantford, like, try to wrap your head around this. Game 7 of a playoff series. And if you're any fan of the history of this league, you know that in the 80s, the Sioux Greyhounds and the Kitchener Rangers had an awesome rivalry. It seemed like every year or every other they were meeting in the playoffs. So you're taking a game 7 that's supposed to be played in Kitchener and moving it 40-ish, 45 minutes away to Brantford. Why? Because the home show was taking place at the Kitchener Memorial Auditorium, and the home show got the priority date. So the Hounds and the Rangers play in Brantford. Rangers win the game on a game-winning goal by Wayne Presley, who scored 63 that year for Kitchener. But just put that aside for a second. Could you imagine, Dan, today in any OHL market, the home show bumping a playoff game and the playoff game being relocated to a neighboring community as if?
Well, maybe that's why those twin pads attached to the auditorium in Kitchener got built quickly after that to house the home show, so it never happened again. But yeah, this day and age, you could imagine a GM throwing a conniption to have lose the actual home ice advantage for a game 7 in the playoffs, something crazy like that. Like if it's something out of their control, like the ice plant breaks or something, maybe. But for a home show, I'm sure there were some furious words being exchanged behind the scenes because even moving down the road to Brantford with how well Sioux fans travel, I'm not sure that was really a home game for Kitchener anymore.
Yeah, such a good point. And I'll tell you, it just blows my mind to think of that. I mentioned Wayne Presley with the winning goal in that game 7. Rangers would go on to win it 7-3. Presley's goal broke a 3-3 tie. Kitchener would go on. That was the year Kitchener was hosting the Memorial Cup in 84. And it was their third trip to the championship in 4 years. They were there in 81, lost. They were there in 82 and won. They hosted in 84, but they actually lost that OHL final to the Ottawa 67s. And so Ottawa goes in as the OHL champs. Rangers got some revenge by beating the 67s in the round robin 7-2. Ottawa comes back and wins the Memorial Cup that year, also over Kitchener 7-2. Go figure. That was also the year, just for you hockey historians, Mario Lemieux played for Laval and was in that Memorial Cup. Laval lost every game in the round robin, didn't move on. Lemieux that year, I talked about Wayne Presley's 63 goals for the Kitchener Rangers that year, 130 for Mario Lemieux. Not points, goals. Goals that year. I miss that era of hockey so much, eh? Like, can you imagine? That's ridiculous.
Well, and just a little side note on Mario Lemieux too. I remember a lot of the narratives after that Memorial Cup tournament was, oh, this kid's nothing special. He looked lazy and unengaged at the Memorial Cup. Well, he turned out okay, I think. And Mary Lemieux might have been the laziest fast skater I've ever seen. I think it had something to do with the mechanics and his size, because he'd look like he was just loafing up the ice, barely carrying, and yet he's pulling away from a guy whose legs are pumping. So a little context and perspective was probably needed there.
He might have also been a little bit slower or seemed that way because of the two guys hanging off his back as he made his way to the net. There's that too.
Yeah, that's a factor as well. Yeah.
One more quick note before we skip along here. When you mentioned Steve Staios, Ottawa, probably one of the worst kept secrets in the National Hockey League, because as soon as he left the Ontario Hockey League and went back to the NHL ranks, he's a good friend of Michael Andlauer, which just made me think of, so Andlauer, of course, the new owner in Ottawa, or at least the face of, owns the Brantford Bulldogs. And we learned this week, thanks to some reporting by Jim Parker in the Windsor Star, that the Windsor Spitfires ownership group is also involved in that purchase with Michael Andlauer. And we'd also known prior, so too is Rocco Tullio and the Oshawa General. So we have three OHL interests in Brantford, Windsor, and Oshawa connected to the Ottawa Senators ownership group. That's kind of fun. So we thought we'd throw it in.
Well, yeah, and we all know Michael Andlauer had a minority share in the Montreal Canadiens before he bought the Ottawa Senators, had to sell it. So these connections are not new. They happen all over, and I think it's just a good thing with this firming up those ties between the OHL and the NHL.
All right. You know who's having no fun right now? At least I don't think so. That'd be Stan Butler. We also said goodbye to a long serving official in this league over this past weekend. And yeah, I'm going to call him a legend, gets recognized in Oshawa. Plus, our prospect of the week still to come. Oh, my goodness gracious. We have lots left to talk about on this episode of the OHL podcast. Okay, Dan, just before we get to that guy that's probably not having any fun right now this season so far, let's talk about Kevin Hastings, who this past Saturday was recognized by the league in advance of his final game. More than 1,000 games patrolling the lines in this league. And if I could just add, the crew that night in London was Hastings and Dustin McCrank working the lines, and Sean Reed and Jason Faced as the referees. Who got any good officials anywhere else in the O on that night? What, that's an all-star crew if ever I heard one. But Kevin Hastings hangs him up at least as a linesman. He's going to move into a role in the league's front office with the officiating team.
Yeah, what a great career, great story Kevin Hastings has been. It's gonna be weird not seeing that number 61 in stripes out on the ice for the coming years. But I think the fact that he's moving into a development role is great. I remember last year on a couple occasions, the OHL brought in one case, a couple female officials, another case, a couple crossover officials, and saw Hastings working with them in just little subtle tips and supportive gestures. And I think you probably can't have a better mentor in stripes than Kevin Hastings.
The guy loved what he did. And when you bring that much passion to your role, it's hard to start picking nits and faults. I mean, everybody has their off nights, but one thing that you'll hear, I think, across the board when it comes to Kevin Hastings and the way he approached the game, he was very good at communicating. He'd communicate with the benches, he'd communicate with the players. And as a linesman, I mean, if a play was offside, somebody had to tag up, or you could hear that guy throughout the arena if you're listening. So the communication was obvious down on the ice, but certainly even well above. You could hear that guy barking things out. You'd often see him because he's based out of the region of Waterloo. He's helping out at training camps, other things that are going on around the community. And he's going to be a really strong mentor for the Ontario Hockey League and up and coming official. So it's hard to imagine. And frankly, Dan, if the guy's body wasn't beaten up as much as it's been beaten up over the years, he just had I think it was a second on the same knee surgery. I mean, he'd still be doing it. He'd still be doing it, but the body, the spirit is willing, but the body is weak in this case.
Yeah, and I know just as a final parting note on that, I know that he agreed to officiate the inter squad games that Kitchener Rangers had at their development camp in August. And as he came off the ice, I heard him remark to someone that he was dying, just dying, not sure how he's still standing. So, but it just speaks to the character and connections he has in the loop that he was asked to do that and agreed in the condition he was in. But great career, Kevin, and congratulations.
So the Flint Firebirds, the Niagara Ice Dogs. I mean, Flint maybe in the way they've gone 0-3. We already talked about the really tough Opening weekend, Niagara, probably not all that surprising, although in the first week we thought more competitive than we might have thought them to be. And the Erie Otters, again, a team kind of coming back up, but I don't know. 0-3 is a little bit surprising to me, and they had to come from behind on Saturday night. They got a lead late, but then Owen Sound would come back to even and win it in overtime. 0-3 start for the Erie Otters as well.
Well, Mike, when we do the predictions, it's not a question of if I'll be proven a moron. It's who's going to prove me a moron. And Erie Otters were my dark horse in the West, and it's way too early, I know, to write them off. But I think when I was predicting them, I think I called them to come fifth as a mid-pack team, as a dark horse. Loved their offense. Malcolm Spence, I love Kerry Tarrant. They brought in uh, top end import picks. They looked to me on paper like a team that could do some damage. What concerned me was, are they going to keep the puck out of the net? The back end looked a little loose to me. Lalonde has been up and down in net. So you had some question marks there about whether or not they could prevent goals. And I think the early returns are that those were well founded. And unlike Flint, who can make a coaching change, try and make things happen, well, Erie just brought in a very high profile coach last year. So it's not like that's in the offing right now. And that's a coach who loves control, trapping, slowing the pace down, keeping it low scoring, and he is not going to be loving what he's seeing so far.
Yeah, I'm with you on the horses that the Erie Otters have, and every reason to maybe think if they get a chance to gallop and find their stride, who knows what the Erie Otters can do. Look, they've got 65 games left to play. Nobody's sounding an alarm bell here. It stands out as curious, particularly to your point around preventing goals. Those Guelph Storm were galloping all over the Erie Otters this past weekend in an 8-0 victory. Give Erie credit for coming back from behind to it. I'm sure Otters fans would have loved them to win that game versus Owen Sound. Goes to overtime. Erie ends up with the point. But also in that game, or going back to the Guelph game, we have to touch on this too. Bruce McDonald got a 1-game suspension. It was a 5-minute major for boarding with about half a minute to go. I'm going to be honest with you, Dan, and I'm always on the side of player safety. I think the league has done a really good job with this, but to me, it looked like Bruce McDonald got a 1-game suspension for finishing his check.
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different take on this because I know the league is very strict on justice, and I don't think the hit in itself was extremely bad or terribly against rules. I think with the blindside rules that the league has now, it's questionable any of these things that come in from the side. I think what I didn't like about it, and I surely what the league didn't like about it, was the time of game to have such an aggressive hit on a vulnerable player. And it's not that it was necessarily a dirty hit. He finished a check along the boards, but player was clearly vulnerable with that type of momentum. You see the head smashing into the glass. You know bad things can happen there. And it's, to me, it's one of those things that, no, Bruce McDonald, it wasn't the worst thing I've ever seen. You probably don't deserve a lengthy suspension, but it's kind of one of those, buddy, there's 30 seconds left in an 8-goal game. Let's not try and kill anyone. This isn't the time to send those kind of messages. You want to rub them out, fine, but let's not try and send them through the boards at that point in the game. That's my take on that one.
The interesting thing is the game was just 7-0 at that point, and the Storm would get one on the ensuing power play to make it 8-0. I hear where you're coming from, and in that context, I'll grant you that the 1 game seems to be about right-sized for suspension. My problem is, and the older I get, the older school I get. What if you don't finish that check? I hear where you're coming from in terms of the severity of it, I suppose, but every coach everywhere, whether it's Stan Butler behind that Erie bench or Dan Mahar, because I know you coach kids that are younger. If you don't finish that check, what's the message? You come back. I want to see you finish your check. Don't peel. I don't know. So that just, to me, if you're peeling off at a situation like that, it's a change to the way the game is played. And I know this isn't the first time, but I'm not so comfortable with that. It's a physical game. Come on now.
No, you're not. You're not wrong, and you're absolutely right. There are coaches out there that say, finish your check, show me you care, play to the final buzzer, show me something. You don't want you soft pedaling the last few minutes like you don't care. Having said that, you know what I would say if I was a coach and saw that in that situation is, where was that 20 minutes ago? Where was that 30 minutes ago? Like we just got our butts handed to us. We got embarrassed. If there was a little more of that earlier, now it doesn't matter. Now it just looks petty when you're doing it with 30 seconds left down 7. That's what I'd be saying to my player. Sure, finish your checks, play to the buzzer, show me you care. But come on, let's not bring this out at the tail end of a game where it just looks like maybe questionable sportsmanship.
Brady Stonehouse of the Ottawa 67s. The 67s only one win through their first 3 games of this OHL season, but he's got reason to smile. He signs his entry-level contract, the old ELC, with the Edmonton Oilers and the Sudbury Wolves, who are doing what many predicted they would do as this season began. They're a force in the East in the early going. Quentin Musty signs his ELC with the San Jose Sharks. So we wanted to give a quick nod and congratulations to those young men as they get set for the next chapter. Obviously, they're still going to be playing in the Ontario Hockey League, and they are a force right now for their respective teams. But it's always nice to see the kids take the next step in their career. And a guy whose career in the Ontario Hockey League goes back more than 4 decades was honored with his number raised to the rafters in Oshawa this past weekend. Dave Andrechuk, former Oshawa general, gets recognized in a pregame ceremony.
Yeah, it's kind of two ends of the spectrum there, right? A guy who came through the league, had a brilliant career, often took a lot of flack for not being the best skater, but you don't score that many goals unless you're a really skilled hockey player. So great to see him honored and on the 2 ELCs. Of course, congratulations to those 2 players. Not a surprise at all in Quentin Musty, a top pick in the OHL draft, first round pick in the NHL draft. We knew that was coming. But for those that don't know Brady Stonehouse, he is one heck of a player. Flies a little under the radar in the OHL sometimes based on the talent that's been around him in Ottawa and some of the big names in the league. But Brady Stonehouse brings it pretty much every night. So I'm sure he showed that at camp, and that's why he walked away with a signature.
It's a great point on Andrechuk as we kind of flip narratives here, where, maybe not the best skater, but what's the point of the game of hockey? It's to score goals, right? He had 58 in his draft year before he got selected into the National Hockey League. And he scored more than 600 in his pro career. Not a lot of guys can say that.
Oh, that's phenomenal numbers. And I know people like to diminish things that optically maybe aren't aesthetically pleasing on the ice, as the Pavel Bure flying through the team. And Andrew Chuck was more just a mountain of a man that would park himself in front of the net. But things aren't just banking in off his knees and back. He had wonderful hands, terrific shot, great muscle memory and instinct for where the holes were, and just a brilliant scorer. And sometimes I hate to see that taken away from when people look at video and say, "Oh yeah, look how slow that guy was." He wasn't. He was a heck of a player, and the stats kind of prove it.
I should have checked ahead of time, and that's terrible. I glanced at his stats over the weekend. It's funny because I'm watching out of town scores, and I'm like, why is the Oshawa game like so far behind? Oh, pregame ceremony. So I flipped through Anderchuk's stats on his DB page, and it's in the double digits anyway. Consecutive seasons with more than 30 goals scored, and 4 of his final 5 seasons. Think about that. 4 of his final 5, he scored 20 plus. That's impressive. And so more than 600 in his NHL career. Andrechuk's number 9 gets raised to the rafters at Tribute Community Center in Oshawa, along with Tony Tanti's up there. And hey, Bobby Orr too, but not number 4. He wore number 2 when he played in the Ontario Hockey League. So a little bit of trivia for you trivia nuts there. And Oshawa tends to do these things really well. So good on them and good on Dave Andrechuk. Okay, let's get on before we call it an episode to our prospects of the week. I wonder, we didn't even talk about this ahead of time, Dan. We're probably going to be different, but we'll see. You start us off. Who is your prospect of the week this week?
All right. Well, I made a last minute change, Mike. Mine is Ryan Payette based on him booing you at the parade. I think that kid's showing real encouraging signs. So, but no, seriously, we may have the same guy. I may start getting accused of having a Mississauga bias, but I couldn't go anywhere other than Ryerson Leenders this week. OHL goaltender of the week, but what a brilliant start he has had. 4-0, 2 shutouts, a 1 goals against average, 969 save percentage. I mean, those are all world numbers. Obviously, they're not going to continue all season because no goalie could ever keep up that type of a stat sheet. But what a brilliant start for Ryerson Leenders, 2006 birth. a second round pick to the Mississauga Steelheads. So 2 weeks in a row, I'm going to the Steelheads, but I felt I had no choice because what a start he has had. Who
Get
you got?
ready as I look further afield here. Get ready for Dan to go to Mississauga even more often next year when Porter Martone is NHL draft eligible. Let that sink in just because of the way his birthday falls. He's not even draft eligible this year. And you've probably seen it, but if you haven't, go check out the OHL's video highlights because many saying Martone's goal this past weekend is already a candidate for goal of the year. It's early, but it's spectacular. My prospect of the week this week, recency bias notwithstanding, is Zane Parekh. And I'm picking Zane Parekh because I mean, I got to see him in person, which always helps with my analysis, but obviously he plays the game of hockey. But when I say this is how I wanted to try to describe it, so work with me here. You know when you you play a musical instrument or somebody plays another person. In other words, like they basically do what they want to you. That's what Zane Parekh is doing to the game of hockey. He doesn't play the game, he plays the game. And when he's on the ice, like he had himself a 4 assist night when I saw him. So, but he's everywhere. At one point, he's on the left point, then he's around in the far corner, then he's back at the, and every time he's on the ice, something is happening, and he's just a whirlwind of constant motion. Late in the game, Saginaw's up huge, but he tried to make a pass from behind his own net, standing flat-footed, to the opposing team's blue line. Didn't quite work, but it almost worked. But just the fact that he was thinking about it and anyway, he is something else. And so Zane Parekh, because he essentially is reinventing the game at the position, and it's just a lot of fun to watch. Enjoy him in Saginaw. He's going to be a key piece, obviously, says Captain Obvious of this team. But Zane Parekh and his 4 assist performance versus Kitchener is my prospect of this week.
Yeah, great call, Mike. And I think we're seeing that green up arrow beside his name for his NHL. Mid first was last I saw him in most rankings and could even go up from there. I think what scouts are looking to see, the offense is obvious, skating, instincts, shot, everything off the charts. But they're looking to see is can this kid also defend and maybe limit some of the risk in his game. And I'm telling you, from my viewings earlier this year, there's an edge in his game. Doesn't shy away from the physical stuff at all, has a little bite to his game, and I'm sure the NHL scouts are going to love that. So that green up arrow may continue all year with that kid.
We had a lot of meat on the bone in this episode. Let's hope it continues this way. If any organization and or owner wants to do something that's worth us talking about, feel free to do that. Any more coach changes? We're still not sure. Dismissed, resigned, probably dismissed. Anyway, lots for us to talk about this week, and it's a lot of fun. I do want to make sure we change one thing moving forward, and that is multiple Ryan Payette mentions in the same episode. Like that's just like that's got to come to an end. Okay, I've got a reputation over here. We can't have this.
Well, yeah, and actually, if I am slightly disappointed in him at all, it's that there were no projectiles. It was all verbal. So Ryan, work on this for the next time, okay?
I don't think his arm could like he doesn't have that kind of distance or accuracy. Of course, you'll get another episode of the OHL podcast on Friday, and I am looking forward to this one selfishly and personally because when I broke into the league, this was the guy who was the president and general manager of the Guelph Storm. But it goes so much beyond that. A member of the Guelph Sports Hall of Fame, the chair of the board of governors in the Ontario Hockey League when the expansion happened from 16 to 20 teams. Do you think he's got some stories about that? Oh, yes, he does. And as a former part owner of the Guelph Storm, how difficult was it when the ownership had to change hands to a corporation that didn't have its roots in the city of Guelph? So lots to talk about with this big name guest, in my humble opinion, coming up on Friday. So we'll look forward to that. Dan, do you know, you probably already know who I'm talking about.
I do, and he's probably happy he's a former Guelph store because their number one center looks like he might have an extended stay in Boston. So so a lot going on in Guelph these days, but I'm really anxious for that interview, Mike.
Yeah, good call. The Storm playing so well, even without Matthew Poitras, who may very well get his 9 games in with the Boston Bruins. Could be a talking point in the weeks ahead. All right, that guy over there is Dan Mahar. Find him on Twitter at Dan Mahar. My name, Mike Farwell. on Twitter at Farwell_OHL. Hey, feel free to send us an email anytime. Okay. OHL podcast at Rogers.com. Give us a like, subscribe, tell a friend about the OHL podcast. We come to you twice a week with all of the information you need to know about the greatest hockey league in the world. Your next episode comes out on Friday.